Welcome to the NJ Criminal Podcast and part 2 in this series.
So the policy also has a couple addendums, and one of the addendums deals with if and when a law enforcement officer in New Jersey would be permitted to use what is known as conducted energy devices and other less lethal devices and ammunition. Talk to me about that. What's that all about?
Well, probably, 10 or 12 years ago, the Attorney General's office added enhanced mechanical force, which basically dealt with the tasers or the electronic control weapons. They made it a little bit more stricter to use that type of force.
I was a prosecutor at the time, and they required, my recollection is that any officer that was going to carry a taser had to get tased.
Yes, I believe that's...
To know what it felt like.
I have not been through the taser training specifically because I've been a detective for probably 16, 17 years. So I wasn't on patrol when we had them. Tasers did not come to New Jersey probably until about 2010. So I never had to go through that training, but it's certainly a higher degree to have to use that force option. Now, New Jersey was still a force option state.
What does that mean? What does that mean?
Well, basically, it's very difficult to say you can and can't use this force option in each particular incident. Every officer is different. You start getting into weight, size, height, experience of different officers. What may apply to one officer may not necessarily apply to another. So it just depends on the circumstances of each individual use of force encounter. When it comes to the tasers, like some other parts of the country, they're not as strict as New Jersey. New Jersey's got strict guidelines for using tasers. They don't want police officers indiscriminately using that particular force option, and they're scrutinized pretty harshly when they are used. So you certainly have to have the specialized training for that, and you have to be, just like any other force option that you use, you have to be prepared to explain your actions and what happened, what you did, and why you did it as an officer.
Let me ask you a question, just going back for a minute to use of deadly force. Is it true that if an officer discharges a weapon, a firearm, and has made the decision under the facts and circumstances of the situation that he or she is in to use deadly force, that they are not shooting to wound, right? Is that right?
When police officers use deadly force, they're shooting to stop the threat.
Okay.
That's basically, they're stopping whatever threat they're perceiving at the time, and they're perceiving
so if it's deadly force, then the proportional use of force would be deadly?
Correct.
Okay.
So you really have to make sure you perceive in the right circumstance, and you can't use deadly force just because someone shoplifted and they're resisting or running away from you. You have to be ready to justify your actions of death or seriously bodily injury to you or someone else. I mean, that sets off when you have an officer involved shooting or deadly force incident. That sets off a whole set of circumstances. In a special investigation that happens into those type of incidents. And I was part of that for over 14 years. It's a case, an investigation like no other. You really, as a detective and a supervisor in situations like that, you really have to make sure you cover everything. Although as a detective, you don't give your opinion on investigations, whether it's a homicide case or an officer involved shooting. Your job is to gather the facts. And gather as much information as you can. That way, the trier of fact can decide whether the use of force was reasonable or not. But they can't do that if you don't have all the facts. I've read other agencies' investigations into use of force, and they certainly don't cover everything that they probably should. And that could come back to them if it goes to a civil trial or a criminal case, or whether it's administrative. Possibilities at the end on the officer. You really have to make sure you investigate it thoroughly and leave no stone left unturned.
Without giving me any obviously any specific cases, but just some hypothetical examples of scenarios that you can think of where there may be a different requirement of a police officer in a certain situation compared to, the old directive versus the new directive. Can you think of any kind of hypothetical examples to kind of illustrate how this new directive is different?
Well, you certainly they added this time the proportionality of the force.
Is that that a big highlight of the difference? This I guess it's core principle number 2 includes this proportionality.
Yes.
Okay.
Not just what force option you decide to utilize, but to the extent that you utilize it. Again, you can't just use deadly force on someone that's just because they're shoplifting, and just because whatever the instance is, just because you're justified in using force. At some point, you have to de-escalate, whether that subject is no longer a threat to you or no longer resisting. You have to come down at some point. You can't just continuously keep using it infinitely as long as you want.
Right, but how is that different from how the policy was before? I mean, you really, officers never could have used deadly force for shoplifting, right?
No, but when it comes to the proportionality, they really explain and go into that a lot more, and officers really have to be cognizant of the ability to de-escalate. That's the big one of the big buzzwords that came around in the new guidelines, and then every officer in the state of New Jersey had to be trained in de-escalation. Nowadays they really want you to use time, distance, space, cover, try to call for backup using verbal communications, as opposed to, I don't know, it wasn't really a talk, but more the mentality years ago was police officers kind of rushed into the scene. They don't want you to rush in anymore unless you absolutely have to. If you or someone else's life is in danger or something like that, that's one thing. But if you have the ability to kind of step back and try to verbally de-escalate the situation with the individual so you don't have to use force, that's what they prefer you to do, if it's possible, if it's feasible. You can't always do that. So that's why
it sounds like I don't know if I'd want to be a law enforcement officer nowadays. I mean, it sounds like there's a lot of very fact-specific, split-second decision-making that has to happen.
Well, that's true, because that's the exact standard that came out of Graham versus Connor. They couldn't give a definition of what objective reasonableness meant, but they stated, we understand officers have to make split-second judgments on the circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving, the amount of force in each particular case. And it's what the officer knew at the time, not the vision of 20/20 hindsight. So it is very difficult to have to digest all the new material, especially if you've already had 10, 15, 20 years on doing it one way, and now they kind of want you to take a step back. And you can't just change that mentality overnight. It kind of takes time to be able to do that. That comes with the training and keeping up on the updates on force and case laws that come out. It's important.
Did every officer have to get trained?
Yes, every officer in the state of New Jersey.
Was that like a hands-on training, or what was that like?
Yes, hands-on.
Got it. And
classroom.
Are you involved now going forward in trainings?
I will be. I'm a yes. It's called ICAT, Integrated Communications and Tactics. That's basically de-escalation. I am as an instructor in that, and will be teaching it. So I'll be doing that shortly in the coming months. But like I said, the world of policing has changed, and the officers kind of have to change with it. Yeah. And if you don't want to change, then you can probably try to find a new career.
Yeah, right. Now, we talked a minute ago, there's a couple addendums to this use of force policy. One related to use of devices such as tasers. There's also an addendum related to vehicular pursuits. Is the topic of vehicular pursuits under the umbrella of use of force? Is that something that you also testify about, or can you speak to that at all?
Certainly, vehicle pursuits is definitely not my expertise. Mm-hmm.
Why do you think it was included as a kind of an addendum to the use of force policy? Is it just because it's kind of goes hand in hand in some circumstances, or?
Well, when you talk about use of force throughout the country, a lot of times pursuits and use of force kind of go hand in hand. So that's kind of why they kind of do things like that together. But they certainly, the danger that comes from vehicular pursuits to either the police, to the person that they're chasing, or just to innocent people either walking or driving down the street, is just astronomical. It's not worth being in a pursuit unless you're chasing someone for one of those enumerated crimes that they talk about, like murder or manslaughter or carjacking or something like that. It's just not worth it. I mean, sometimes you have to, as a police officer, you have to learn to live to fight another day. And I teach that when I do teach use of force, that most of the time it's just not worth it. You have to take that step back and rely on your investigative ability or the assistance of detectives in your department to follow up and apprehend that person later. It's just not. There's too much risk involved. Not just your own safety, the other person's safety, as well as innocent people walking down the street. There's nothing worse than having a civilian being killed that wasn't even part of the situation at all. So that's kind of why they came up with that, and that's also kind of going along out throughout the country, is restricting a police officer's ability to pursue in certain circumstances.
Right. The policy also includes the ability for the public to access certain data related to use of force. Are you familiar with that? Are you able to speak to that at all, or no?
Yes, the Attorney General's office started a database that every officer has to go into when they report the use of force. Now, before this database started, we were all doing our own reporting anyways within our own departments. Now it's basically a centralized database kept and maintained by the Attorney General's office, which they're going to make available to the public for each officer, I guess, in the entire state. Or they're probably
basically
not going to give
any officer who is involved in a situation where there's use of force. There's certain, obviously, forms and things they need to fill out, and they have to do that within a certain period of time. It's got to be uploaded and accessible. Is it almost like a public records type thing, or?
Yeah, I've never gone into. I never had a reason to look, but from what I understand, the public, if they haven't already, can go in and check the uses of force by each particular officer. I don't think they're going to give each specific details in each individual case, but I think they can track how many uses of force each officer has. And obviously, that just depends on your environment, typically, and where you're working. If you work in a small, affluent community, your uses of force probably aren't going to be high. But if you work in a very urban area, like Newark or Irvington, Camden, your uses of force are probably going to be high. Or unless you have some other specialized unit that you work in, like a fugitive task force or something along those lines, you're typically going to have more use of force because that's what the situation you're dealing with almost on a daily basis.
Thanks again for tuning in, and don't forget to subscribe anywhere you listen.